That movie has probably been the most effective movie made to help people understand. If you want to go into that world, this is what you're going to have to understand and face. If you don't, now that you saw it, if you don't really want to go into that world, get out of here.
Welcome to More Than a Movie, American Me, a podcast that digs into the history and mystery of American Me, a film directed by and starring Edward James Olmos that had a huge impact on Latino cinema and culture. I'm your host, Alex Fumero, and I'll be diving into the behind-the-scenes controversy. And although I keep getting warned time and time again to leave this alone, I am still on a quest to find out what really happened to Ana Lizárraga, Charles Manriquez, Manuel Luna, and potentially others, all advisors on the film American Me, who wound up dead in the weeks and months after the film's release. But more importantly, if they were killed because of their participation in the film, we want to find out why. Every episode, I'm going to try to peel back a layer of the story behind this film 30 years after its release by trying to go deeper into the intentions and the motives behind the film and the backlash. Our last episode was all about Edward James Olmos, the director, producer, and star of American Me. Olmos has never addressed the aftermath of the film and seldom even talked about the film itself. He told our last guest, Rafael Agustin, that he, quote, can't talk about it. That clip you heard at the top was a rare instance of Olmos answering a question about American Me from a young filmmaker at New York Film Academy. During an audience Q&A, the young woman asks Olmos if he's encouraging them to tell stories about great Latinos. Why did he choose to play Santana? Coming off an Oscar nomination for his iconic role in Stand and Deliver, Edward James Olmos earned the biggest opportunity yet for a Latino filmmaker, to direct and star in a major Hollywood release. And he chose a controversial subject for his directorial debut, the Mexican Mafia, a notorious prison and street gang that at the time was at the height of its powers. It was a bold move, and it didn't end well. To this day, there is still so much stigma and mystery surrounding this film. One of the biggest controversies in the wake of the film is whether the film actually served to discourage kids from joining gangs, which was almost his intention, or if it actually in some ways made gang life seem appealing, despite all the bad shit that happens to the characters.
You know, that the Chicano gang life, I mean, that's the movie that is closest to reality, you know, that people go and watch. And so it's one of those films that gets kind of passed down from generation to generation. And it's still relevant, you know, and it's still, but it you said it just gets kind of, you know, passed down and watched and rediscovered. Yeah, but it's like a class. I feel like it's a classic. It's like, to me, it's like The Godfather. It's like Goodfellas. It's one of these films that captured like a real moment in time.
That's actor Jacob Vargas. If you watched any movies in the 1990s or 2000s starring a Latino family, you know who he is. He played the tough kid, but the good tough kid, the one you were rooting for. Just to name a few of his credits, he's been in Mi Vida Loca, My Family, Crimson Tide, Get Shorty, Selena, Romeo and Michelle's High School Reunion, Next Friday, Traffic, Jarhead, Cesar Chavez, and currently you can find him streaming in National Treasure Edge of History on Disney+. As a kid, I really liked him as an actor. Not just because he's very good, but because there were so few Latinos in film and TV, and I found him inspiring. Like a lot of people I talked to for this show, he grew up in Los Angeles around a lot of gangs. The world of American Me was a little before his LA, but it was familiar. He had friends and relatives who were involved in the life, and some who have even lost their lives. So we'll talk about his career. I want to know how he's thrived as a Latino in an industry that throws more oil slicks and banana peels at you than fucking Mario Kart. But we'll also talk about being a kid in LA, growing up around real gangs, and the impact American Me actually had. Was it the cautionary tale Olmos claims it was, or did it somehow make kids want to escape into the dark and gritty world it presents? This episode of More Than a Movie, American Me, is all about the road paved with good intentions and where it really leads. All right, so why don't you start by just introducing yourself?
This is Jacob Vargas, and I play Paulito in American Me.
In American Me, Jacob played Edward James Olmos' younger brother. Like a lot of Latino actors at the time, Jacob grew up idolizing Olmos, the cool guy on Miami Vice, the weird guy in Blade Runner. So he gets in the casting room for American Me, and EJO isn't there. Instead, he watches two white guys argue over whether he should get this life-changing role in the movie.
I mean, I basically auditioned, but I remember, Eddie, not call him Eddie now because we're boys, but, I remember watching Edward James Olmos in Miami Vice, and I remember like he was just like a bad dude, man. Like, he just had this vibe and he was so cool. And I remember, specifically watching an episode where he's on the beach, and he takes his, I think he's like wearing a Speedo and he's like walking on the Miami beach and going to the, and I was like, that's cool, man, because I never saw that before. Someone that looked or resembled me doing that and looking like, like a sex symbol was the coolest thing ever.
Totally.
So I remember hearing that, he was directing this movie, and I went into auditions. But I auditioned for a small role. It was like maybe 3 lines, like for one of the homeboys, and I remember his assistant at the time was a guy named Danny Otto, and I have a lot of gratitude for Danny Otto because he said, "Hey, I think Jacob should read for this other role," And I remember the casting director was there, and they kind of got in a little argument because the casting director would say, "No, that's already cast," and and he's like, "No, but I think Jacob is perfect for this role," and I'm sitting right in front of him, and they're having this argument. And he goes, "No, I'm gonna record Jacob in this role. I'm gonna send it to Eddie. I think Eddie should see him." And so they had me, read the role of Paulito. And then it was like, "Okay, thanks. We'll be in touch." And next thing you know, they said, "Hey, would you mind traveling to Folsom Prison to meet Edward James Olmos?" And I was like, "Okay, So here I'm on a plane. It's up in the Bay Area, so." I remember going outside of Folsom Prison. I had to go inside. We had to go through the whole process. And I guess they were filming a lot of the stuff. They were already in production, shooting stuff on the yard. And Eddie comes to see me, and he's dressed in his
The prison blues.
In the prison blues. I was like, oh shit, this. So, but and he just said, "Hey man, I just want to kind of welcome you to the project, and just I was very impressed with your read, and just want to let you know that you're the guy." I was like, "Well, a phone call would have sufficed, but hey, thanks, it's great." But it was such a cool experience, that he told me that in person, and he also he said, "Look, I this is a really important film, and and you can tell like just how emotionally like invested he was in this, because he said, look, we're losing too many of our children to this violence, and I really want to tell a story that's a cautionary tale of what happens when you choose this life." So so that's what we're what we're making. So I already kind of feel like, oh man, this is heavy. I just felt the weight of it, and I just felt the responsibility of it. But I've seen it, man. I saw, by the time I was that age, I saw like a lot of my friends. I got friends that got killed that were in gangs, and lost to drug dealing and drugs and all that stuff. So I saw the effect, that it had. So, so I was like right there with them, like, cool, then let's do it,
And knowing those people being kind of your peers, because one of the things I'm so interested in with you is that you were so young doing this.
Yeah.
So like the kind of kids that he's trying to reach are around your age.
Yeah.
And so do you think, like, looking at that, were you like, these guys aren't going to listen to this shit? Or were you like, no, this could make a difference?
I thought it could make a difference. I really did. I also, it's Eddie Olmos telling you that. So, so I think it had weight, and so I believe, like, dude, if anybody's gonna do it, it's Eddie. And if you look at my character, my character mirrors, those kids who idolize their older brothers or uncles who went to prison, and who looked at prison as something, like a badge of honor, and
a rite of passage.
You're right. Yeah, exactly. And just how easily that cycle continues. And I remember, man, we were shooting some of these scenes where, and Eddie, I mean, he got super emotional. I mean, he had tears in his eyes, and he's like, "This is what I'm talking about. This is what we need to stop."
Coming up, we'll go through some of the rumors surrounding the movie, including why certain advisors to the film wound up dead. But first, capitalism. Welcome back to More Than a Movie. I'm Alex Fumero. We're talking to the actor Jacob Vargas about the movie American Me. If you remember, we started this podcast because of the memoir by Danny Trejo. He said he turned down American Me in part because he felt that Edward James Olmos wasn't taking it seriously, or maybe too seriously. We're trying to separate fact from fiction. And one of the biggest accusations from Danny Trejo is that Olmos began living his character everywhere, even in places where it wasn't appropriate, like a Jewish deli in Beverly Hills. The first time Jacob met Olmos was actually on set in Folsom Prison, with Olmos wearing prison blues. But he didn't get the sense that Olmos was still in character. What he did find was a man possessed in a different sort of way.
Well, I mean, when I saw him, he was actually in wardrobe. So because we were working together, and he was in the scenes and also directing. So, I mean, I guess so. He would be dressed as Santana would, with like the Dickies and the Pendletons and all that. So
that's normal.
Well, yeah, he's working
in the context. Yeah,
in the context. So that was not unusual. And I feel like I think all actors do this in subconscious in a way. Even though it's not method, we tend to pick up on just some of the way this character would speak and behave, and some of the mannerisms. And I think sometimes that bleeds out, subconsciously. 'Cause I mean, I've done that before as well. Where my family or my wife say, you're kind of acting a little different. It's because you kind of you do bring it home a little bit, and it takes a while for you to kind of shake off that character if you've been doing it for a long time.
That's really good to understand that. Do you like?
But going back to the Folsom thing, yeah, I mean, he was dressed in the blues, but because he was shooting, so they were already filming, and I don't think he would say, hey, let me change out of my wardrobe to go meet with Jacob.
Yeah,
he just walk over from set, say hello.
And when he talked to you, he didn't talk to you like Santana. He talked to you like Edward.
I mean, but Edward kind of talks like San. I mean, Edward does have that thing, like, hey, vato.
He does have
he that was kind of his thing. I don't. Like, I mean, I'm thinking if there was anything out of the ordinary or different, I just thought that was just kind of Eddie,
Yeah, fair enough. So do you remember what's the first scene that you got to shoot yourself?
One of the first scenes was the letter scene where I come in and I say, hey, I got the letters that you sent me, and I'd read them to all my friends, and he would kind of like brag about him. I mean, but it was all, it just felt very, very natural, man. I think Eddie created this really comfortable environment, where I feel like everybody felt listened to. Everybody really felt like they were a part of the film. Like even the extras, I remember he would tell the extras, like, hey, this is a very important thing. You're not just in the background. What you're doing is very important. So other people really felt, the community, because a lot of extras were real people for the neighborhood. We were shooting in Hazard and in the projects, and I remember people really felt like they were a part of it, and I remember the time, there were a lot of the homeboys that were hired to do security, just kind of, so that everybody really felt like involved and a part of it.
And action.
La Primera lives, that's it. Lives through us. It gives to us. It is us.
You posted a couple of years ago. You posted a video from the documentary Lives in Hazard.
Yeah,
where you're being part of it is you being directed by Edward James Olmos. Can you talk a little bit about what it's like to be directed by this guy who's such a legendary actor?
Again, man, listening, I'm thinking about our conversations when we were filming. It was all he would sit down with you and say, say, Jacob, this is such an important scene because we need to show the world the dangers and the violence of this life and really kind of tell you just how deep and important this scene is. And again, man, he was like just super passionate about it, but then he just kind of let you do your thing, and he didn't get too involved as far as giving you any line readings or anything, but he would just kind of and I remember one scene specifically was the end of the movie where we do the drive-by. I mean, he was a wreck. He was like an emotional wreck. Like he was like crying and I remember you saying this is there's just too much of this. There's too much of this happening in our community, Jacob. We're losing too many kids and we're losing too many family members and and this is it. You guys are telling the world showing the world what this cycle does. Yeah, like I said, he had a mission, man. Like I just remember he just really believed that this movie could make a difference, in our community, and it wasn't just for entertainment. It was he didn't want to glorify, the life.
You can only control what you put out in the world, not how people react to it. And it's pretty clear that Olmos was making a movie with a message. But 30 years after its release, American Me is not known for preventing gang violence. If anything, the movie seemed to have caused more of it. Do you see any irony in a film that was intended to stop gang violence? Maybe it actually recruited more people to it.
I mean, I guess there is some irony in that, but I feel like I'm sure it probably stopped a few kids. Like I'm sure a lot of people will see that and say, "Hey, I don't want any part of that as well." I feel like with certain movies, it can be singled out that American Me is the only one. Like you look at the Goodfellas and all these other films that are cautionary tales about the mafia. In a way tend to glorify it. And they just because these actors did a really good job and all these characters were cool and Santana was like a cool dude and he was in charge and held a lot of power. So I just think that there's an attraction to that, and some people will look at that above what the real meaning of the film is, that it's a vicious cycle.
And in the context of like this, basically, I mean, there was Boulevard Nights before it, but in a way, American Me like starts a kind of subgenre of these types of movies.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Clifton Collins Jr., who's your buddy, is in one of my favorites, which is 187.
Okay.
But so in the kind of catalog of these kinds of movies, where do you rate American Me in terms of like in the category of this kind of like Chicano gangster flick? Is American Me like the least glorifying? Do you think it's the one that's the most kind of cautionary?
In my opinion, yeah, I feel like it's the least glorifying in its intention, but also the more realistic. I thought because it kind of named names, in a way, and really you saw the truth, and I think because of that, it's more of an attractive film.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely named names.
Yeah,
I mean, the film name checks La M,
right,
and a lot of the discussion around Ana and some of the other deaths were that it was retribution for participating in a film that some people felt was, libelous and disparaging.
Mm-hmm.
Joe Morgan being one of them, who like filed suit.
Right.
As an actor in the film, how do you feel about that?
I mean, I always say at the end of the day, I was just an actor. You know what I mean? I wasn't aware. Like I didn't know the story. I didn't know about any of this. Going into it. You're just an actor playing a role. So, I just know, like, according, Eddie, I know he said, look, he had permission, to do the film the way it is. So so I don't know where, it got lost in translation, but at the same time, you're always a little, worried about that, and I hope that's all in the past.
Oh yeah, the Danny Villarreal and Danny De La Paz both said that they'd had people sort of warn them to be careful in the process and in the aftermath of the film.
Nobody's ever told me anything. So I don't know. Maybe they don't like me very much. Like, Jacob, go out there and be free. Be out in the open. But then again, I didn't. I wasn't portraying any of the actual MM members either. I was just the little brother on the outside.
Very good point. Yeah, totally. And then on the street, I'm curious, like, what was the vibe, right? Like, do you get people going to you and being like, "Yo, like, what happened? Like, what do you think the word on the street is that this was blowback for the film?"
I remember when it first happened. Yeah, a lot of people had questions, and I had zero answers, for them. But I haven't gotten anything lately. Like I said, like once you guys got in touch with me, I said, "Oh wow, American Me!" Right? We haven't talked about that film in like 25 years. So I think a lot of people may have like forgotten about it. Or it's not that pressing of an issue as it was back then. Mm-hmm.
I heard from other actors in American Me that Chicano audiences weren't too happy with the movie or its depiction of Chicano culture. This is our first movie, some of them said. And gang war is what we get? Jacob's parents saw the movie and didn't really know what to think. But for his own generation, the movie was an instant cult classic. Just not for the reasons Olmos would have wanted.
Funny, man. My parents, I'm thinking, I remember we watched it. We went to the movie theater and I just think my parents, thought it was kind of violent, But my parents, all they watched was like telenovelas and like Mexican, television. So they're like, so they didn't know who anybody was. They're like, I don't know who any actors are.
They don't even know Edward James
Olmos.
No. Yeah.
I mean, they do now, but
no, of course. But then they're like, ¿Y la Thalía dónde está?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I remember one time, I did something. I did like a Spanish talk show, and my parents were so excited that I did this talk show, and I'm like, okay, you guys don't understand, but it's just, I think we're just from two different worlds.
Totally.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's definitely not a movie that my parents would go watch. I mean, to be honest with you. But I remember watching it with a sold out crowd. I remember there was like line out the door. It was sold out, and people loved it.
That's
and the funny thing was, I remember walking out, and people were like, "Oh, that's cool, man. Santana was badass," and everybody, and I was like, "Wow, man, it's for it being a cautionary tale, almost like it had the reverse effect, because these characters were, again, maybe because we never saw ourselves up on screen, and now we're finally seeing ourselves, in a big Hollywood film. Did it glorify it? I don't know. My conversations are usually people love the film. I mean, people love the film, but also to explain how the prison gangs work, and for anybody that wants to understand, like, that the Chicano gang life. I mean, that's the movie that is closest to reality, that people go and watch, and so it's one of those films that gets kind of passed down from generation to generation, and it's still relevant, and it's still, but it just gets kind of passed down and watched and rediscovered. Yeah, but it's like a class. I feel like it's a classic. It's like, to me, it's like The Godfather. It's like Goodfellas. It's one of these films that captured like a real moment in time.
Totally. And as you said, it was a film where people saw themselves on screen for the first time.
Yeah.
So you've touched a little bit about the verisimilitude, right? The authenticity of the film inside and outside of the jail. There were extras that were actual gangsters in the dudes who were in gangs. I mean, you see it in Lives in Hazard. Can you talk a little bit about like what it was like to kind of interact with those people, how that sort of worked?
I grew up in the hood. I grew up with gang members all around me all the time. So it wasn't anything, different for me. It's just, they just happened to be from Hazard, But it was, they were cool, man. I mean, if anything, they were cool. If anything, they would kind of give, kind of help out a little bit, like say, hey, cuff the bottom of your pant a little bit here. The crease needs to be, So they were very particular about how these guys should look. And I remember they were very particular about like not being wrinkled. They'd be like, nobody will be wrinkled, like because because we were playing kids. I remember, and so I think like they were putting the clothes on for us, and they're saying, well, these are like younger kids, so they wouldn't be as like well put together. And the guys say, oh no, man, once you get in, man, you're ironing your shit, you're ironing your underwear, your socks, the crease has to be perfect.
Khakis with the cuff and
Right.
the crease.
Yeah. Yeah. And and so or also like I remember when I was doing in one of the things I was putting a tattoo on the so a couple of guys say, look, this is how you would do it. You get the needle and you poke, So they became consultants, in a way, yeah. But like again, man, it was like a big family. Like everybody was really kind of pulling together to make this movie happen.
Yes, everyone was pulling together, but in the neighborhood, anger was simmering in the background. Some gangs wanted to be in the movie, but weren't cast. Others were cast, but didn't like sharing the stage with rival gangs. One of the people negotiating between the gangs in the movie was Ana Lizárraga, a professional gang interventionist. It was her job to make sure the set was safe in a rough neighborhood every single day. And every morning, the film's location manager, Antoinette Levine, would give everyone a safety talk. What was your impression of these kind of safety talks that folks like Antoinette Levine would give to the cast and crew?
Honestly, dude, I don't even know if I was paying attention to the safety. To be honest with you, I was like, all right, I don't know what this guy is talking about, but all right.
That's very funny.
But I do remember, they would say, hey, like I guess some other gangs were kind of coming around, and I remember there was an issue with some people feel left out, like why are they including this gang and not this gang? And I remember there was some kind of like behind the scenes truce that was going on. But again, man, we weren't privy to that. I mean, we were young kids, so I think we were kind of protected against all of that, and they kind of did a good job of separating us from that.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about some of the consultants that were on the set. So I'm sure you're aware that about a couple months after the film came out, Ana Lizárraga was unfortunately killed. And there were a couple other folks, and there's been a lot of rumors about the motivations behind that. I'm just wondering, from your perspective as someone who's in the film, do you remember hearing that news, and do you remember how you felt?
It's funny because I had a lot of contact with Ana. I mean, she was the one that helped a lot with the extras, and she was there kind of making sure that everybody was listening. You guys got to understand, this is the movie. You guys, if you're gonna be in the scene, you got to stay in the scene. You can't just walk off, and like leave and because a lot of people don't know what it's like to be an extra. Like, no, you're doing the same thing, same scene over and over and over again. So I do remember her being around there and talking to some of the kids, because some of the kids were still they're kind of like little peewees, and and some were wannabes, and so I'm sure always like saying, hey, this movie's for you guys, man. You guys, and she was like, stay away from this, stay away from that, and stay in school. So I just remember her being like, very vocal. And then I, next thing I heard that she was killed. It was really sad.
Do you remember? Can you tell me more about her and her character and how?
Like I said, I didn't know her that well. You know,
Okay.
she just seemed like one of those aunts that's always telling you, hey, stay in school. You know, don't be a pendejo, and you know, she was always out there with the community, with the and being kind of a liaison to what the people needed, and present that to the production. Like say, hey, these people give them some water, or hey, they're in the shade too long, or something, So I mean, that's kind of what I remember about her.
Coming up on More Than a Movie, I asked Jacob about growing up in Pacoima and how he avoided gang life by basically entertaining the bangers. Welcome back to More Than a Movie. We're talking to Jacob Vargas about American Me. So we're obviously here to talk about American Me, but I wanted to ask a little bit about how you grew up, like how you got to be so successful in this industry. I mean, well, first of all, my understanding is that you're from LA. You were born in Michoacan.
Right. Yeah, I was born in Michoacan, but my parents immigrated to the U.S. when I was a year old. So I pretty much grew up in Pacoima, California. It was the hood, pretty much. I grew up breakdancing. So that was my thing. It was like there was some kind of truce there where if you were breakdancing, then the gangs kind of left you alone. They just kind of gave you a pass, like, oh, okay, he's a dancer, cool. Leave him alone. We're not gonna try to recruit him or anything. So that was my thing. They would actually make us dance for them. They'd be like, hey, fool, dance. And you're like, all right. So
that was the trade.
That was the trade-off. Yeah. Grew up in Pacoima, went to San Fernando High School, San Fernando Junior High.
Jacob was a break dancer in high school, and that's what kept him out of trouble. Eventually, somebody suggested he try out for the school play at San Fernando High School. And that's how he found out what acting's really about. People throw food at you when they hate it.
I never planned on becoming an actor. I got discovered breakdancing by my first manager. And so she was a teacher's aide at an elementary school nearby. I got suspended for breakdancing. So, part of my punishment was, well, you got to go pick up your sister from school every day. So I started breakdancing in the schoolyard while we went to pick her up. This teacher's aide named Andrea Jones saw me and she said, hey, would you want to be an actor? I manage a few kids here. They do commercials and, they do some work. So, you got a really good look. Would you want to be a breakdancer? On TV and commercials. I said, yeah, why not? So it's really odd, man. So then next thing you know, if you think of it now, we hop in her car, and and she drives us, to my house. So next thing you know, Miss Jones, what we call her, she said, hey, I want to represent your son and as an actor, and I'll take him to auditions and I'm gonna manage him.
Yeah, what did your dad say? Because I want to know the immigrant parent reaction.
He's just like, what? And who is this woman? Why are you in her car? Why are you putting yourself in danger and all that kind of stuff? But for some reason, I wanted to do it. I'm like, Dad, come on, just and she said, look, I'll pay. Because my parents I don't have any money. I'm not going to pay for any classes or pictures or anything. And she's like, look, don't worry about it. I'll pay for it. I'll front you the money. And, so she had a lot of belief in me, which is really odd because I just met this lady. And then next thing you know, I have an audition. She's like, you have an audition for a role of a breakdancer on Different Strokes, the TV show. And I'll take you down to Universal Studios, and dude, I auditioned for the role. They say, hey, can you start today? I remember auditioning at 9 a.m, and they said, can you come back at noon and start working on it? And dude, and next thing you know, man, I spent a whole week on set. We're rehearsing. We do the live performance. It was a small role, but it was in front of a live audience. I mean, it was just an amazing experience. It was great. And then, so my dad said, okay, maybe there's something here, and the next thing you know, I get my check and they're like, yeah, you stick to this. Stick to this acting, son.
¿Cuántas horas
It's
estuviste
good. Right.
ahí?
Right. And I remember because with that money, I bought like school clothes for all my brothers. We're like, because this was during the summer when this happened.
What is your favorite scene in the movie? And it doesn't have to have you in it. What is your favorite scene in the movie and why?
My favorite scene of the movie and why? It's a good question. I mean, I'm biased, It'd have to be, for me, it'd have to be like, the end of the film. Here you hear these kids kind of doing a little drive-by, and they give it to the youngest kid, to make his bones, and the tragedy of it is there's not even a target. It's just like which one. It's like it doesn't matter, So just the just how arbitrary it is, and just how callous it is, and that's the continuation of this cycle.
But even that final scene carried its own kind of tragedy. An actor who played a young gang member in the backseat of the car was actually shot in real life before the movie's premiere. The shooting left him blind.
Yeah, he was one of the kids. He was one of the kids that was in the scenes with us.
He was in the backseat.
Yeah, and I remember. It's funny because you just brought back a memory. Is that his big dream was like, dude, I can't wait to see this movie. I can't wait to see this movie when it comes out. And that was his big. I remember he was kind of like in and out of trouble, and this was something positive that he was doing and moving in the right direction. And I remember hearing that he never got to see the film. That's tragic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On our next episode, we talk to the actors who played two of your favorite characters from the movie, Danny De La Paz and Daniel Villarreal, a.k.a. Puppet and Little Puppet.
If that is so, why were we allowed to shoot at Folsom?
We could never have made the film without a green light.
Why were we allowed to use like 300 prisoners?
Yeah.
They could have killed us at any moment.
That's on our next episode of More Than a Movie, American Me. More Than a Movie, American Me is a production of Exile Content Studios and Trojan Horse in partnership with iHeart's My Cultura podcast network. The show is produced by me, Alex Fumero, at Angry Yuka on the internets. And our senior producer is Nigel Dwara. Rose Reed and Kareem Tapsh are the executive producers. Production assistants from Sabine Jansen, Ana Octavio, and Stella Emmett. Mixing and sound design by Eduardo Albornoz. Our executive producers at iHeart are Giselle Bances and Arlene Santana. For more podcasts, listen to the iHeart Radio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.